Hey, everybody, welcome to episode 429 of our Tick Bootcamp podcast. We're here today with Dr. Andrew Petersen, who's a Lyme-literate medical doctor, and my special guest co host, Justin Lindorf. So, first, I want to say hi, Justin, and welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thank you for having me.
And Dr. Petersen, we're so excited to go over your journey and what you're doing to help the chronic Lyme community. So, thank you again, Dr. Petersen, for joining the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on here. This is an honor.
So, Dr. Petersen, before we get into the really cool stuff that our listeners want to hear, such as what you're doing to treat people, how you're helping people get better, let's talk about what got you into the field of medicine to begin with. When you were in school and you were just a kid, did you ever dream of being a doctor?
Yeah, I don't know. It's a funny question. So as a little kid, no. I actually had, I don't know, two or three things that put me into medicine, and none of them were because I had someone that was really sick that inspired me to become a physician. The first thing was my dad's an engineer, and he came home from work one day. I came home from school one day, and I went in the bedroom to fold laundry because that was my chore. And there was like a, what had it have been? Like a 45 revolver and a police badge on his dresser. And I was startled, right? I'm like, what's going on? And I asked my dad, and he was like, oh, well, I was laid off. And so probably as a 9-year-old, I was like, ooh, I want a job where you can't get laid off. That scared me, right? In high school, I loved debate. I was a great arguer, I'll say. And so I thought, oh, I'll go into law school. That'll be good. I can argue all the time. And I think perhaps my disagreeable nature, the fact that I like to debate, actually was one of the things that led me towards wanting to, I would say, go down a path where you're sticking up for the little guy, I guess. But my sister aced the LSAT. She missed one question. I'm not exaggerating. And so I was like, well, I'll be damned if I'm the second best lawyer in the family. So I couldn't go to law school at that point. Um, and I had a professor in college who was as dynamic as any professor could ever be, and it was a biology professor. And I was fairly naive. I went to college a year early, not because I was super smart or anything, but just because my dad was in the military and he got transferred a lot. So my senior year would have been in a new school, and I just figured, well, I'll just go to junior college instead of go to my senior year somewhere else. And it was just inspiring. And so as a 17-year-old kid, I said, well, if my grades are good, I'll be a doctor. And if they're bad, I guess I'll be a science teacher. Now my kids, I have 6 children, and they say, well, Dad, I think you're more of a science teacher than you are a doctor anyway, because you're always teaching your patients what it is that's going on in their bodies because they're trying to figure this out. They've been trying to figure it out for years. And so you got to do both. So undergraduate, sort of childhood, that's maybe what guided me.
So, Dr. Petersen, let's just talk a little bit about that, right? So, first of all, you have 6 kids,
Yes.
and now, before I get into your family dynamic, I want to learn what you went to when you went to school. Where did you go to practice medicine, and what was your specialty when you first were
Sure.
getting into medicine?
Yeah. So after college, right? So I'm in medical school, and I was still super naive. I think I'm naive to this day. I went to med school in Texas, and I actually became a DO. My sister had fallen rappelling, and she was in a coma for almost 6 weeks.
Wow.
And there were two brothers that took care of her that were physicians. One was an MD, he was the neurosurgeon, and the other one was a DO. He was the physical medicine and rehab doctor. And I would go to the hospital and just sort of do my homework there in her room because you just don't know what's going to happen when your sister's in a coma on week 3 and 4 and 5. And so it was close to the school, and I'd go there and study, and it was quiet. And sometimes Val King, the DO, would come in, and I would talk to him about like, I didn't even know what a DO was. I'd never heard of a DO. And so
Can you explain that more for our listeners in case they don't know? What is a DO compared to like a primary care doctor or
Sure,
a
you
regular
bet.
MD? Like
So
all the differences there.
I didn't know this as a pre-med student, that there is this type of physician. They are licensed as surgeons and physicians, the same as MDs. Everybody thinks all the doctors out there are MDs. And really I would say now, probably 85% of the physicians are MDs and 15% are DOs. And it's just a different degree. And what happens is DOs take all the same classes that MDs take, plus they take some what are called manipulation classes. That sounds controlling, right? But it's really osteopathic manipulation, sort of like chiropractics. So we have all these courses in chiropractic, musculoskeletal adjustment, and then all the regular classes. And so with his maybe tutelage, I said, well, if I want to go, he told me this. He said, if you want to go into primary care, If you want a broad look at people's health, then become a DO. But if you want to subspecialize, then do like my brother did and become an MD. And so I decided to go to DO school. And I would say the vast majority of new medical schools in the United States are osteopathic schools. DO just stands for Doctor of Osteopathic Medicine. And I would bet you that still 80% of the Lyme literate physicians are MDs, right? So DOs are not, it's not like we're specially trained to be Lyme doctors. Frankly, my experience being on the board at ILADS is that nurse practitioners and naturopathic physicians are far more open-minded and willing to treat patients with tick-borne illness than MDs or DOs. So if you're looking for a particular degree to say those are the good guys, it's not even DOs. But that was, so that I went to DO school, medical school in Texas, and then decided to specialize in family medicine. And we went to Altoona, Pennsylvania, which is a Penn State affiliate program. So it's just 30 minutes south of State College in Pennsylvania. And I did some of my rotations up there at State College, and most of them were in Altoona. And it was a great program. It was what's called an unopposed program. So there was no one there besides family doctors, right? That were residents, right? The hospital had the surgeons and the neurosurgeons and the ophthalmologists and the nephrologists, but there was nobody ever in front of you to deliver the baby or to be first assist on the surgery. So it's a good program for a family doctor because you were the only resident there. And ironically, I didn't know this was ironic at the time, but I'm in tick country and I never saw a Lyme patient that I'm aware of. Certainly my attending physicians never said, oh, and this is Lyme disease. Oh, see this patient here with chronic fibromyalgia? That patient has Lyme disease. No, I never heard that. I am certain that I saw plenty of patients with Lyme disease. I just didn't know it.
So you mentioned, though, Dr. Petersen, that now you've been a part of ILADS, the International Lyme and Associated Disease Society, and you touched on Lyme literate doctors, which you now are. But when you were, young in your career and you were just starting out and going to school, and then now going through this, coming up to the Northeast and doing all this work, Lyme wasn't on your radar at all. So you had no specialty, no knowledge of Lyme disease at the time.
I'm sure
correct?
that I probably answered one question about Lyme disease on a board exam or, a shelf exam as you're going through medical school. And it probably had something to do with, pick which one of these is the bullseye rash or what's the treatment for Lyme disease, right? And so what I knew is you give people 2 weeks of doxycycline, and then if they have a bullseye rash, then they might have Lyme. And even then you should be a little skeptical, right? Like it's totally not on your radar. And here's the thing, I don't think that the physicians like my attending physicians or the ones teaching me in medical school, there was nothing nefarious about it. We're just ignorant. It's just ignorance.
So walk us through give us a high level overview of your life from that point forward. So you're, building your family, you have now 4 kids. When, and also what you're doing to practice medicine as you're growing in your career, and eventually when Lyme gets put on your radar.
You bet. Yeah. So from Pennsylvania, I wanted to work in a really tiny town because the idea to me of being a family physician was I really wanted to get to know my patients. I wanted to take care of them from cradle to grave. I wanted to deliver babies, but I also wanted to work in the nursing home. I wanted to work in the emergency room, the whole 9 yards, right? And so we went to what we thought was a tiny town, beautiful town. I love this town. It's Wamego, Kansas. It's not far from Manhattan, Kansas. And I worked there. The CEO of the hospital that hired me actually took another job before I started. And I really liked this guy. And the guy that replaced him, this was his first job, and I really didn't like the second CEO. So we were only in Kansas for 2 years. It was great, but it actually turned out to not be a very small town because we were 15 minutes to Manhattan, Kansas, which Kansas State is. And so for people that are from a big city, that's still tiny. You're talking about our town had 6,000 people, and Manhattan maybe had 40,000 people. But as far as saying, as a family doctor, I'm going to take care of all these things, it didn't have quite as much opportunity as I was hoping for. So a friend of mine said, hey, you should come join me in this little town in Texas. So I joined his practice. Well, I mean, we were both employed by the hospital, but we were the only 2 doctors in the town. This town is Wellington, Texas. And one of the greatest towns in Texas. If anybody from Wellington, Texas listens to the podcast, know that I love you. Collingsworth General Hospital was a 13-bed hospital, what's it called? Level 5 trauma center. What that means is that you have a doctor, right? Like it's to be a level 5 trauma center, that means you're going to get flown somewhere, right? So I was the chief of staff of the hospital. I was the nursing home director. We did everything you could possibly do, from emergency room care to admit to the hospital to, all the sports physicals. I would jump out of the stands at the rodeo when a cowboy would get stepped on and was bleeding to go rush down to the field and help him go to the hospital, right? Like, that's how small this town was.
Wow.
And this is really, I think, important for how does a guy like me become a Lyme doctor? I'm in this little town. No matter where you go, you know the patients and they know you. You know their family, right? They know your family. You care about each other. It was really a beautiful town because you got, I don't know, 3 different churches, 1 high school, 2 gas stations, and 2 blinking lights. And I couldn't buy ice cream at the grocery store without somebody saying, "Hey, doc, I've had this cough. What do you think?" Right? So I loved these people, and I think they loved me back. It was great. At the same time, and this is true of a lot of physicians, and maybe this is an admission of just the weaknesses that we have as humans. Doctors like to think that we know a lot of stuff, right? We think we're the smartest guy in the room. The reality is we're not. We just memorized a lot of stuff. And so there's this, you're sort of torn between, I love these people and I want to take good care of them. And then at the same time, there are people coming to the emergency room at 3 a.m. for back pain, and they had an appointment with me at 3 p.m., but they missed their appointment. And when I walk into the ER, being woken up out of my bed, and I'm like, "What are you here for?" "Well, I had a nail appointment," right? "That's why I missed your doctor appointment." And I'm like, "Well, this is ridiculous." And so it's weird because on the one hand, these patients, I wanted them to get better from what ails them. And when they wouldn't get better, I would send them to Baylor, which was an 8-hour drive, or Texas Tech, which was a 3-hour drive, or UT Southwestern, which was a 5-hour drive, and to go see the specialist. And they would come back, and there was no workup that I hadn't already done, right? They were just on a different brand of a similar medication, right? And so you start to, as a young family doctor, think maybe we're not as smart as we think we are. The specialists aren't figuring out what's wrong with these people. And I'm not talking just about tick-borne illness, right? They could have gone because they had irritable bowel disease. They could have gone because they had chronic migraines. Now, those, of course, both could be partly tick-borne, but people, the physicians, people expected the specialist to figure out what was wrong. I expected the specialist to figure out what was wrong, and that wasn't happening. Simultaneously, I was starting to get jaded because I keep getting woken up for silly stuff. And the people that aren't getting better, that are trying to get better, the doctors don't know what's wrong. And so there's this experience of saying, wait a minute, I'm not helping the people that want help. And the people that don't really seem to want help are the ones demanding all my time. So it was around that time, it would have been 2009, I think, more or less, that I had a few patients that came and they said, "Dr. Petersen, these are my symptoms. This is what I read. I think this might be what's wrong with me." And no one at that point had mentioned Lyme disease, but you're just sort of insecure. You've been practicing 5, 6, 7 years, and you're like, what could be wrong with this person? Maybe I should just read what they brought me, right? And it was actually a mold patient that probably was the first sort of unusual case that I saw when I was practicing.
Can I pause you there, Dr. Petersen? I just want to interject with a couple of thoughts, right? I think what you think was something that really was not an ideal situation for you, because the people that needed help, you couldn't help. And the people that really were blowing you off for a nail appointment and were bothering you at 3 a.m, that allowed you to be a very well-rounded, medical professional, because you were seeing people in this small town with a diverse set of symptoms. And I think that probably led you to be the doctor that you are today, because you saw these different things and you didn't know at the time, but many of them had these underlying deeper causes that specialists weren't even identifying, right? And I think it really provoked curiosity
100%.
in you to say,
Yeah.
I want to help deeper, and I see all these diverse sets of symptoms that nobody can help with, and I think I might be able to, right? So I think this sort of
That's
set you on your
true.
path.
And also there was a moment of introspection and saying, I think I'm becoming jaded. I think I'm becoming an asshole. I don't want to be this person. Because if I'm negative to the person in the emergency room, it's because they woke me up or whatever for something trivial. Wait a minute, but it wasn't trivial for them, right? And so there was these two things happening at the same time. I was recognizing that I actually needed, not just that I wanted to care about my patients, but that I needed to. And simultaneously, we don't have the answers. And
Right.
I think both of those things happening together made it so that I was able to start to listen to patients when they brought something to me and said, "Hey, I read this. We live at an amazing time. We live sort of at the apex of the information age. I don't want to sound like a conspiracy theorist, but it's harder to get information on the internet now than it was even 5 years ago, right? So there was this moment when you could get all the information that was put on there. And so patients brought this in, and if they have an unusual disease, you don't remember every zebra from medical school, right? And so you're like, okay, well, tell me what you think it is. Yeah, I'll read the article you gave me. And it was only because of all those things happening at the same moment that I was recognizing that I wasn't as caring as I needed to be and not as knowledgeable as I needed to be, that this was able to happen. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but I think you were humble and you recognize that although you're a smart man, you don't know everything because no human being knows everything, and you wanted to learn more to help your patients. And I think the contrast we see in other doctors with other patients we've had on this podcast is when patients go to a doctor and they say, I ran every test, I don't know, it must be psychological. That's because they're not open-minded and they're not humble to accept the fact that maybe they just simply don't know, right? And I think that's the comparison of you to somebody else's. You're a more open-minded doctor, which again is another, I think, trait that led you to be a good Lyme literate medical practitioner.
Well, I hope that that's true, and I appreciate that. I would say, in defense of my colleagues, because I love my colleagues that fail to do this, but I would suggest that most of the time it's because they're insecure. And I think that because I remember feeling like, well, I graduated, I passed all the tests, I'm board certified, I'm supposed to know all the answers, but I know I don't, right? But I hope no one else knows, right? And so it's like the emperor has no clothes sort of a thing, like, wait a minute, if they figure this out, then the charade is off.
Right.
And so I think a lot of the times doctors they're just insecure about saying, I'm not sure what's wrong. If you have some ideas, I'll consider them. Right. That just it totally undermines the potential authority that they could then say, well, let's do this. And the patient was like, well, you just asked me for the answer. Why should I believe you? So anyway, it's just the weird relationship doctors and patients have had for the previous 100 years that I do think that that's slowly changing, right? Like I don't go to my accountant and he tells me exactly what I have to do. We counsel together and then we come up with a plan and I do what the accountant mostly recommended, but some things I'm like, well, what about this? And right. The whole relationship between doctors and patients is currently changing in a good way, in my opinion. So.
Yeah, I think Justin, you want to come on in, right?
Just going to mention, I have been Dr. Petersen's patient for a long time. And one thing I always appreciated about his approach was his willingness to listen to possible or potential ideas, no matter how ludicrous they sounded, and his willingness to say, you know what, I don't know, give me 2 days, I have some time tonight, I can read or go search for something, and his willingness to let me try a treatment if I was willing to, because my case was like so far gone that we were really just trying to keep me alive most of the time. And so I was kind of like, I will be a guinea pig if it's going to help other people with this disease one day. And I will let anybody that's going to write this or help me do this treatment, if there's a possibility it could make me feel better, my quality of life go up, then I would do it. And Dr. Petersen would always take time to read about it or to offer new ideas. But he would always say, I don't know if this is going to help. It's helped such and such these people, or it's helped a few of my other patients, or I have a colleague that it's helped one of their patients, it could help you. And I also have type 1 diabetes, and so that like complicated a lot of normal treatments that people do for Lyme. And he was always willing to read about everything and find a way for me to try whatever treatment I was willing to let myself go through.
What's great about Justin is exactly what he just said, as far as I want to be able to help people too. He does that now. I actually send patients to Justin now, which is really cool.
Yeah.
Because we have, he's like, can I try this treatment? I'm like, well, yeah, I think that's a good idea. Try it. Or I don't know, but try it. Right. And now I send patients to him. So.
Yeah, and I know there's in a bit, we're going to talk about how you guys came together, right? But before we get there, Dr. Petersen, I want to ask you, you mentioned the first curious case that came in was a mold case, and that's when it really opened your mind, right? Can you pick up on that where you left off earlier?
Yeah, sure. So, and this just, I think, highlights how initially I'm sort of closed-minded and ignoring patients. And maybe I want to share this story so that if there's patients out there who are experiencing this, don't lose heart. Okay. So there was this family. They were cotton farmers. It was just a couple, and they had one son. and the wife, they were probably in their early 40s, I'm going to guess, maybe early to mid 40s. And she had fibromyalgia, right? Classic fibromyalgia patient, exhausted all the time, headaches, some achiness, hurt in certain places. And of course, she didn't, her mood was not what it otherwise would be, right? And so I've read about fibromyalgia, and as far as I know, there's nothing to do for it. And in my mind, if I'm honestly admitting how I felt back then, I sort of think, well, her husband's a cotton farmer. He makes like $1 million a year. That's not an exaggeration either. I mean, if you farm cotton, you make a lot of good money. If you just lease the land, buy the seeds, the bank rolls, the whole thing. So they're making good money. They're one of the more wealthy families in town. And in my mind, I'm just like, well, maybe she just doesn't want to vacuum, right? Like, it's just she doesn't feel like being that ambitious. And again, I apologize for feeling that way at that time, but that was sort of in my mind. Well, then a year later, their son starts to have the same symptoms. And that was a little weird. I'm like, well, but he's about to start college. He's just finished he graduated high school. He wasn't feeling great, so he didn't go off to college right away. Sort of makes sense. He's the son of a farmer, so he can just work. But now he doesn't feel good enough to go to school at all. I'm like, that's a little weird. But maybe he's just not that ambitious either. A year after that, it might have been 2 years, the dad comes into my office in probably late May, and he says, Dr. Petersen, I have not planted yet because I can't get out of bed. And I know enough because I'm not a cotton farmer, but that's what they did in that part of Texas. And I know enough about the season that I'm like, if you don't plant in the next 2 weeks, you'll lose your crop for the year. And he's like, I know. I just can't get up. I'm so exhausted. And it wasn't actually that family that brought mold to my attention. It was another woman in our town who also, her husband was a cotton farmer, and she was feeling sort of crappy. And she brought this stuff to me and said, read about this. And I read about it. If I'm telling the whole story, I didn't connect the dots that this family was sick from mold toxicity until a little after that, because they lived on their farm, they irrigated their cotton, and they had a basement. They had one of the only basements in town. I have no doubt that their problem was mold toxicity, and it just, the mom didn't detoxify as quickly as the others, and so it affected her first. There's another story of a patient that also opened my eyes to Lyme, and still I was unsure of what it was. But the story, if you hear the story, you'll be like, oh yeah, of course he had Lyme disease. This was a cowboy, and there's lots of ranching and cotton farming in the panhandle of Texas. And legitimately a cowboy. That's what he did for a living, is he roped cows. And, so every day he's out on the ranch, and the foreman, would tell him what pasture they're supposed to go, check the cows and, take care of them, give them shots, whatever. And he would come in about once every 5 to 6 months with the worst prostate infection, just couldn't sit in his saddle of his horse. And he's just not feeling right. But his only real complaint to me was, I cannot sit down in my saddle. I got to stand on the stirrups the whole day. So I would treat him for a prostate infection with doxycycline, and prostate infections are not easily treated. And so I'd put him on doxycycline for a minimum of a month, and oftentimes 2 months. And he'd come back at the end of the 2 months, and I, just for his follow-up, and he's like, oh my heavens, doc, I feel so much better. My prostate infection is gone. But you know what's really interesting, doc? I don't have joint pain and my headaches are gone. I feel so much better. I can work all day now. It's like I feel like I'm a superhuman. And in my mind, I'm like, well, you're superhuman because you're a cowboy, right? Nobody can rope and ride and work as hard as cowboys do. So I just kept dismissing it. And every time he would say, can you just leave me on this doxycycline? And every time I would ignorantly say, well, it's really not good for you to be on it, so let's stop. And so basically for this guy, I probably treated his Lyme disease for 3 years, but I treated it off and on without knowing he had Lyme disease. Of course he has Lyme disease. He's sleeping out there in the sagebrush, right? He honestly had every single symptom. It's embarrassing now that that was sort of that my first Lyme patient I was treating, I had no idea I had Lyme. So.
Yeah, but you didn't know that. Nobody told you about Lyme disease in school, right? There was nothing on your radar. Yeah. So how were you supposed to know about it? You had no education. There was no information about ticks or Lyme disease through, public awareness campaigns, which is a little bit different now, but still is lacking, right? So, I don't know how you would have known otherwise.
I couldn't have known. But now when I look back, now that I'm a Lyme expert, I sort of feel like I need to go back to Wellington and find these people out and then be like, okay, here's what you have.
Right.
right? Hopefully some of them are listening to the podcast.
Yeah, so how did you become this Lyme expert, right? So you're in
Okay,
Texas,
so from
you're
there,
stumbled through all this. I'm curious to know how you fell into this community.
you bet, you bet. All right. So at that point, so I realize I'm becoming somewhat jaded. I realize that there's more to medicine. I realize that we need to find the root cause of problems. And so I go do a bunch of continuing medical education at an organization called the A4M, the American Academy of Anti-Aging and Regenerative Medicine. And it was really eye-opening. Once you drink the Kool-Aid, you can't undrink it, right? So now I'm like, oh, wait, we can actually help people be healthy. I like that idea. So my wife and I, her parents live here in Utah, where I'm at now. They were getting older, 80 years old. And so we decided we're going to move to Utah and I'm going to open a practice that does integrative medicine, right? Still, I don't know anything about Lyme disease. I'm sure it's something that the A4M or the IFM might have been talking a tiny bit about back in 2010, but not like they do now. And I joined a group called Holtorf Medical Group. And Kent Holtorf, absolutely a mentor of mine, phenomenal physician. I love that man. We're still good
We've
friends.
had Dr. Holtoff on the podcast, Dr. Laufer. A lot of his team have been
Yeah,
on this podcast.
no
We've interviewed
surprise
them.
at all. He's a
Yeah.
great man. I love him to death. And so I open up my practice, my Holtorf Medical Group sort of satellite clinic, and he starts teaching me about Lyme disease simultaneously. So and I'm a pretty religious guy. I was in bed asleep, and I sleep great. I can sleep perfectly, sleep like a baby. I wake up and I've got energy, right? If I say all these things, my Lyme patients might resent me a little bit, but I'm sleeping like a baby. And my practice had been open for maybe 5 or 6 months, and I get woken up out of a totally normal deep sleep, and I have this impression: go online and look up the Lyme community. Just search up Lyme, right? And so and I really do believe that this is God that woke me up and said, "This is what you need to do." I'm sorry. I don't want to tear up because it's embarrassing, but I
No,
go
Dr. Petersen, I'm a man of faith. Rich, who's my co-partner here in Tick Boot Camp, we're men of faith, and we don't believe in coincidences. We definitely believe God's hand is involved in all this. And I think, many of us in this Lyme community are now living out our mission, which is to help other people in this community. So we 100% agree with you. So it doesn't
Yeah.
sound corny to us at all.
No, and I appreciate that. But so I really at this point, so I get out of bed and I search, Utah Lyme disease, and I find this Utah Lyme disease support group, right? And it's almost like I wasn't even myself. I write an email to the president of the Utah Lyme Association and just say, hey, I've moved to Utah. I just want to let you know that I am willing to treat Lyme patients if there are people that cannot find anyone to take care of them. To my knowledge, at this point, there's no one in Utah taking care of these people. I have no idea. Again, I live my life very naively, right? I'm naive to the fact that there were already some people caring for Lyme patients. I just get woken up. God says to me, you need to. And so they asked me if I would speak at one of their support meetings. And I was like,
But you knew nothing about Lyme, right? So you literally knew nothing about Lyme other than God told you help the Lyme community. So now you're going to go speak
essentially,
about
yeah.
Lyme
So
and you don't know
Dr.
anything
Holtorf
about
had
it?
trained me for like 5 months, right?
Okay, yeah.
And, so that's step one. Step two is I know Joe Burrascano. So I call Joe and I say, Joe, I need to talk to the Lyme community. Can you help me? And he's like, oh, here's my notes. Here's my last presentation I gave, right? So I go and I give a presentation, and I went, I'm studying. At that point, I was like, oh my heavens, I have to do this. So I'm studying and I'm researching, and so I go and I give this presentation, and I met a guy who said, hey, you need to come take care of my family. And in fact, I think Justin might get the story more accurately than me. After that, Justin came to my office. Why don't you jump in here, Justin, and sort of make sure I get the story right?
I had recently been diagnosed with Lyme after a 4-year struggle of misdiagnosis and all other sorts of fiascos. And when I got my diagnosis, I said, oh, this is what's been wrong with me and all of my friends that also became ill around the same time with mysterious symptoms. And so I started getting involved in the community, and someone said, hey, there's this new doctor that just moved to Utah that came and spoke at the support group and said he's willing to take on Lyme patients. And so I called his office and made an appointment to let him know, hey, I have a lot of people in Utah that have Lyme and need someone to treat them, and we can't get treatment. And we have this nonprofit organization, if maybe we can help each other out. And I was still very ill at this point, but my family was very involved in the Lyme community and had been taking care of me for a long time. And so we just started working together in that sense of me. I think I flooded his office
Oh
pretty
yeah.
quickly, like with at least 20 patients in the first 2 weeks of, hey, this guy's willing to treat your Lyme and he won't just give you 2 weeks of doxy and say you're done and get out of here. And so that's just kind of how we met and got together. And we really enjoy each other's company and personality.
Absolutely. I got to give some color to that story that Justin just told. So Justin came into my office. I think you were 20 or 21. Is that right?
I was 23.
23. Okay. So this 23-year-old, he comes in my office. He's got this long curly blonde hair, and he sort of like has these like clam digger pants. They were a little long, like shorter, because I'm not that stylish, right? But he's wearing Birkenstocks and his toenails are painted lime green, right? And he comes in and he's got these business cards that say JRL, what is it? JRL Foundation. Um, and I'm like, this young kid is just decided that he is going to like heal the world, right? and I just was so inspired that somebody who is sick is going to try to, because part of the foundation that Justin had started was to be able to get people tested, right? And so he came in and he said, look, if there are people that come in and they can't afford to be tested, I want to help so that they can be tested, and we'll do a test through IGenics so that they can find out what's wrong with them. And I was just overwhelmed that there was someone that was that ambitious and simultaneously that sick, and two, that he had lime green toenails.
But I do want to comment on all of this because, here you are, you're, new to the space. You meet Dr. Holtorf. I guess I should ask, how did you meet Dr. Holtorf, right? Because he's a leading Lyme doctor. So before we get into your scandal, like what brought your worlds together and put Lyme on your radar to then be woken up in the middle of the night to say, God telling you got to help Lyme people, right?
Right. So at A4M, at the American Academy of Anti-Aging and Regenerative Medicine, he was giving a lecture, and I was at the lecture, and he's one of the more dynamic speakers that you meet, right? And so I'm like, this guy knows what he's talking about. There's a lot of people out there that I think they can get up and they can read some slides, and you're like, I think I know as much as they do. They're just reading this, right? Dr. Holtorf, when you ask him a question, he doesn't look through his slides to get the answer. It's in his head somewhere, right? And so I just approached him and I said, hey, I want to do this. And it's really curious to me. I actually now am a minority shareholder of a company called Forum Health. We have 38 offices around the country, and my goal of doing this was, we have too many guys on the sidelines. And that's how I felt now 12, 13 years, 14 years ago, was I was the kid on the sidelines who wanted to do what Dr. Holtorf was doing, but I didn't know where to start, right? So I go up to him after this lecture and I say, hey, I want to practice this way. That's actually, that happened before we moved to Utah, right? I was still in Texas. I was working for a hospital. I was being paid by the hospital to take Medicare, Medicaid, insurance patients, right? I'm at the behest of the insurance payer and the hospital to do what they want, right? I couldn't just do what I wanted to do. You actually can't. And I don't think people understand the nature of the business with respect to how medicine works. And so your doctor can't just order a test like that for you. What happens is, the more tests they order, the lower their reimbursement contractual rate will be the following contract that they sign. Because if you order too many tests as a physician, your insurers are going to say, hey, you're too dumb, we're going to pay you less, is basically the bottom line, right? So I go to Dr. Holtorf and I'm like, I actually want to do this. And he's like, oh, well, why don't you open a satellite clinic for us? Where do you want to do it? And we debated between Dallas and Salt Lake City, and we chose Utah because that's where my wife's parents live. And so that's how I met him. And I went to California and I trained with him a little while, and he came out here. And so anytime I had a question, I just call him and he'd be like, oh, well, do this lab, do this thing, check this. Right. So I had this mentor that I could bother him at any moment. And Dr. Holtorf's funny because he's a little bit of nocturnal guy. So he'd call me back at 2 a.m. and say, "Oh, did you do such and such test?" And I'm like, "Oh, I hadn't thought about that." And then I'd have to write it down or I'd forget by the morning. But so that's how I met Dr. Holtorf. Was really just initially said, "I want to practice good medicine. Let me hook my wagon to this guy."
And let's blend that now with Dr. Bioroscano, because Dr. Bioroscano treated, I'm from Long Island, New York, which is where Dr. Bioroscano was treating, I think, in the 80s, right?
Yeah.
And
When
he
I
had
was
to
in elementary
practice.
school.
Yeah, he had to practice, and he was basically violating a lot of the standards set forth by, the New York State Medical Board. And they went after his license. He had and again, the Hamptonites, where he was out in the Hamptons, had a ton of Lyme patients that were being referred to him with a lot of money. They funded his legal case, and he won, and just got a little mark on his record. And it was a big thing here in Long Island. I mean, when I got diagnosed with Lyme disease in recently, within the last 10 years, everybody was still whispering about Dr. Joe Bioroscano, right? Oh, if he can help you want to go to him. And now he's with IGeneX, I believe, right? So now he's a researcher at IGeneX is where he's at now. So this guy's been in the field for 30, 40 years. And now, I mean, how did you meet him? You're getting the legends, the kings of the Lyme community to train you to build, to build up your knowledge. So it's just interesting to hear this origin story for you.
So this just speaks to how good of a man Dr. Bioroscano is, right? He didn't know me from Adam when I called him. I just knew of him. I knew that this was one of the guys that knew about Lyme, and that he had put his career on the line in order to do this, right? I had listened to a lecture of his at ILADS. That's it, right? Like, he didn't know who I was. I knew who he was. And maybe part of it is just, I think if you're going to be able to do good in the world, you got to speak up, right? And so I didn't mind speaking up to Dr. Holtorf and saying, "Hey, I want to do what you do. How should I do it?" "Oh, well, open a satellite practice," right? So when I called Dr. Bioroscano and just said, "Hey, I was at your lecture and I'm supposed to give a talk on this, but I'm brand new to this. I don't know what I'm doing." He's like, "Oh, well, no problem. I'll help you." He's just that good of a man. And I like to tell people that, because people come to see me and they've never met a Lyme doctor before, and they think that I'm some sort of a pioneer. I'm not a pioneer, really. There's explorers, there's pioneers, and there's settlers, right? Joe Bioroscano was an explorer. He was even before pioneer, right? The pioneers were guys like maybe Rich Horowitz is an explorer too, but maybe he's a pioneer, right? I think Jim Bridger came out here to Utah, right? He was an explorer. Then you got Brigham Young, took a bunch of people. They were pioneers. Once the train was built, those are just settlers. And it took a little bit of courage, right, to come out on the train. But it's not the courage that Joe had, right? So I have enough courage to treat Lyme patients, but I am not a pioneer in this field. I'm just one that was, I'm late to the game. But hopefully we get more people late to the game, because we need more people willing to do it, right? It's still a little scary, but it's not scary like it was for him.
I mean, granted, they came before you, but if it weren't for people like yourself who continue to carry the torch of their predecessors, like Dr. Bioroscano, we're not going to make progress. We're not going to move forward. I mean, you're building upon the hard work, some of the guessing games they played without better technology, and you're narrowing down with current science and medicine to make things even better for the future. The future of the Lyme community. So we need people like you to keep pushing us forward.
Yeah.
So tell us though, Dr. Petersen. So now you get taught by Dr. Bioroscano, you give your speech at the local Lyme group, and then Justin brings his posse of Lyme patients, and he fills up your doctor's practice, right? So now walk us through what that's like for you about treating these Lyme patients, because even with the help of some of these legends, it's still not an easy disease to treat. So what was that like? And walk us through the initial, beginnings of your Lyme career.
You bet. And I suspect that Lyme patients have this experience. So my eyes are now open to the fact that you have to look for certain problems to help people get better, right? So when you start realizing that health is a possibility, usually you start by realizing that people have thyroid problems or hormone problems or gut problems, right? And I don't mean this in a negative way, but the early integrative physician, the integrative physician that hasn't practiced for very long, that's what they're doing. You come in and you see them and they're like, "Oh, I bet it's your hormones," or "Oh, I bet it's your thyroid," or "I bet it's your gut." Well, they're right. It is all of those things, but those things are problem. They have a problem because of a whole other thing that you haven't discovered yet, right? So for the first 6 months, maybe even 18 months of my practice, even though I'm getting more and more Lyme patients, they were still the minority of my patients. The most of my patients were, men's and women's health and fatigue and And here's what's interesting. You'll get a third to half of those patients better just by optimizing their hormones and their thyroid and their gut, because and I think patients with Lyme disease that have a really severe case, this is surprising to them. But patients that said, yeah, I slowly got sick over a decade, this makes sense to them. You can have these vector-borne illnesses. And if your immune system is functioning okay, not amazing, but okay, you're just tired, you just have more regular headaches than the other person. You don't feel yourself, but you also are still functional, right? And so if we optimize your hormones and optimize your thyroid, suddenly you're back to sort of that okay. You don't feel amazing. You're not like what you were when you were 17 or 21 or something, but you're okay. And so for a while, my practice was more hormones and thyroid than Lyme. But if you're willing to take care of Lyme patients, they come see you, right? And so what became really interestingly clear is that a lot of the patients that thought they were hormone patients actually had bigger problems. They just hadn't been uncovered yet. And you can get those patients better still. It's so fascinating to me. I see patients now that have Parkinson's or that have dementia, and of course, the Lyme community knows that Lyme and Parkinson's can be, one could cause the other. I don't believe it's the only cause of Parkinson's, but I believe it is a cause of Parkinson's. But dementia is a simpler example of people will have dementia and they were fine until they were in their mid to late 70s. Is Lyme part of their problem? Well, absolutely. And Dale Bredesen has proved this and put it in his book and said, hey, this is part of dementia. And so how many people out in the world have a tick-borne illness, whether it's Lyme or Bartonella or Babesia, and they just feel sort of crappy, right? They wouldn't even think of themselves, nor would a Lyme patient think of those people as Lyme patients, but they do have Lyme, and it is contributing to the inflammation that they suffer, and it's part of why we all die, if you will. And so that sort of arc in my career, early Lyme doctor, willing to take care of Lyme patients. I went to ILADS. In fact, Ron Lindorf, who's Justin's father, said, look, if you'll go learn about this disease, I'll pay for you to go, right? Well, I would have paid for it myself, but I'm not going to turn it down. So, and I honestly think it was good because now I have a greater responsibility. I couldn't just say, well, no, I'm not going to do that actually. No, you paid for me to go. I better keep doing it. So at that point, I'm like, oh, God told me to. Plus, I took somebody's, willingness to help me be educated. I can't leave this, right? And so I joined ILADS. I think probably by the time I'd been a member 3 years, I was, nominated to be on the board. And then I was elected by my peers to be on the board. So I served on the board at ILADS for 4 years. That was fantastic because you get to rub shoulders with some men that, in my view, are pioneers, and I'm standing on their shoulders. And you just have that experience, I think, of saying, wait a minute, this is a problem for more people than realize it. And the people that know they have Lyme, sometimes, and I've seen this happen over the last, I'd say 10 years, people that know they have Lyme and became really attached to the idea that Lyme was their whole problem also had to go through the experience of saying, oh, it's not just Lyme that I have, it's also mold, or it's also metal toxicity, or it's also small bowel bacterial overgrowth, or what have you. And so the doctors and the patients are learning together. And whether the patient brought me in new information or I brought them new information, it's the relationship of trust that makes it so that, okay, I can move forward. And I'm sure there's patients I've had that I didn't learn as quick as I needed to. And so they went to some of my colleagues, and thank goodness they got better faster that way. But that's sort of the arc, I think, for most Lyme doctors, because this is an evolving thing that we're learning about.
So I'm going to come back to what you said earlier on the podcast, which is you've always liked to stick up for the little guy. And that's what you're doing now, right? These Lyme patients, and I understand personally, you are defeated. You are weak, you are vulnerable, you are compromised, and you are desperate, and you're helping this community. So it's kind of cool to see that come full circle from what you said earlier on. But what I know our listeners want to hear is, what are you doing specifically to treat? Because a lot of people want to learn tips and tricks from this podcast. And as a Lyme-related doctor, what have you found to be successful in treating patients? I understand that it's not a one-size-fits-all treatment. I understand it's not going to be just one thing. But if you can speak to some of the tools you have used to help people get better, that are some of the tools that generally work pretty well.
Absolutely. And hopefully I can do this concisely. For me, this is really important because I think that patients and doctors we hitch all of our intentions onto one thing, and we're like, if I fix this one thing, then I'll be better. And I think if we take a broad approach to health, we actually succeed. And when we find that I have Epstein-Barr, and if I just cured Epstein-Barr, I'd be better, we're not, right? So here's how I describe this to patients when they first come into my office. The miracle of being alive is that you can make new cells every day, and your body does that, right? And the reality of being mortal is that every day some cells break and die. And what's going on is that if I can make more cells than break, I'm going to be healthier tomorrow than I am today. And if you think about it, in the first 25 years of our lives, we are better and better and better and better with each passing year, so long as we're the typical person. People that have Lyme disease young, I mean, they're robbed of that, but that's what's supposed to happen. You're supposed to have this arc of I just got healthier and healthier and healthier. And around 25, it plateaus and I'm as healthy. That's like me at the prime of my life. And nothing changes between 25 and 35. You don't get worse, you don't get better. And then at 35, you slowly start to get worse, right? This is a healthy person, not a Lyme patient. Why do you start to get worse at 35? What changed? Well, now you're breaking faster than you're making new cells. So if we can optimize, make new cells, and decrease cells break, you're going to be healthy. I don't care what your disease is. So that's the first sort of foundation for people to understand is I got to make new cells and I got to get them to stop breaking. So then we dig a little deeper into what causes our cells to break and how do my cells repair, okay? And the simple side is how do I make new cells? And it's this basic. You got to have the ingredients for new cells. The ingredients are fats, proteins, carbohydrates, vitamins, minerals, oxygen, water. It's why you breathe, drink, and eat, right? If you get the resources, you could make a new cell. But you won't make a new cell just because you have the resources, right? At my home, I have flour, sugar, and butter, but I'm not going to come home to spontaneously cookies, right? In order to turn the ingredients into the cell, you also have to have what are called signaling molecules. Hormones, peptides, cytokines, interleukins, enzymes, growth factors, neurotransmitters, all these things, right? So just like I need the flour, sugar, and butter to make a cookie, I need the spoon, bowl, oven, and person willing to stir to make the cookie. And so for the integrative doctor that says, okay, I'm going to check your hormones, well, why? Well, because if I give you the right amount, now you can turn your calcium, boron, strontium into bone. But if I don't give you the testosterone, you won't make any bone, right? So that's the one side. And this Lyme patients, when I'm starting out talking about this, like, whoa, hold on, you're not even talking about what's wrong with me. Can we get to my problem, right? But if we don't do that, they don't get better. That's you repair. How do we break? We break from 4 things: microbes, toxins, stress or trauma, and electromagnetic frequencies. And I've puzzled over this for a dozen years, and I've tried to make sure that those categories are all inclusive. If there's a 5th category, and you guys have done enough podcasts, maybe you could help me add a 5th category. That'd be fine. I'm not married to these, but it seems like every disease is a combination of those 4 things happening to our cells. Microbes, I really would contend, are the biggest, and everything from Lyme disease to cervical cancer, right? These are infectious diseases. And we used to die of infectious diseases that we could name, like pneumonia. Now, dementia or heart disease, well, those are infectious diseases. You have inflammation and your arteries got clamped up, right? We didn't blame it on the microbe that was living inside of you that created the inflammation, but that's what it was, right? So microbes are the big one. The next is toxins. Anything that gets into your body that isn't useful to your body is a toxin, and you've got your liver and kidneys and lungs and skin to excrete the toxins. And if you're great at excreting toxins, genetically, you're one of those lucky people that probably won't get sick from things like mold or heavy metals. But if you're not great at excreting toxins and you've accumulated some over the course of your life, well, now you've collected bugs over your life, you've collected toxins over your life. Life's harder. You start to fall apart faster, right? Trauma and stress. This is a huge one, and I think the whole Lyme community would say, "Oh yeah, if I've had some significant trauma, my body is in fight or flight, and if my body is in fight or flight, then my immune system kicks into high gear and it tries to fight everything that it sees. And it's actually counterproductive, right? And so stress and trauma, there's a lot there that doctors don't go into, and we should. And I started using IV ketamine for my patients probably as quick as I opened my practice. And it's been interesting to see how I've evolved, because initially it was just for chronic pain. But I actually find that it's more useful for the trauma that they've experienced than for the pain. And if you can treat the trauma, their immune system starts to calm down. Now it matters that you treated the bugs. But if you treat the bugs without fixing the trauma, their immune system may still not calm down and they're still not better, right? So that's trauma and stress. And I could dive into each of these a little deeper if you want, but I don't know, we're probably limited on time. The 4th thing is electromagnetic frequencies. Now, this is one that sort of people are like tinfoil hat, like that's crazy. The way that I reassure people that EMF is not crazy, even if a doctor were to say, what are you talking about? Well, lightning, that's bad for you, right? You get struck by lightning, that'll hurt you, right? That's just a high dose of an electromagnetic frequency. What about a sunburn? Well, that's an electromagnetic frequency. It turns out all of our cells are electrical. That's what makes them fire, right? And so if a waveform crashes into your waveform, it could be a problem. What I've found in my experience is that people that are really sensitive to EMF probably have mold toxicity more than anything else. But any microbe that you have a lot of, it only has one frequency because it's only one cell type. You have lots of frequencies. Your heart fires on a different frequency than your brain or your muscles or your skin or your liver, right? Thank goodness, because if they all fired on the same frequency, it would all happen at once. But a single-celled organism like a bacteria or a fungus only has one frequency. And when they divide, they're identical copies of themselves. And so they still only have one frequency. So that's why those people are the most sensitive to EMF, because they're colonized with something that is, one frequency. So those are the four things that you have to not have. And so you got to improve how do I repair? And then we have to find all those things and get rid of them so that you're better. And Lyme is one of the biggest ones. Anytime I say this to a Lyme group, I'm like, ooh, I better be careful because I don't want them to think I don't think it's important. It's one of the biggest problems, but it's not the only problem. And when we treat it like it's the only problem, I think doctors fail to help people get better. And patients get really disillusioned because they're like, wait a minute, but I keep treating this. Why am I not better?
Yeah, we had Dr. Marty Ross on, and I had a debate with him, and he challenged me because, I was arguing that you can't just address mold and expect to feel better. But he was saying that he has patients where they have mold and Lyme disease and various other tick-borne illnesses. And when he addresses mold, they do have symptom relief. And it doesn't mean that they're still not having, potential Lyme in their body, but their immune system becomes strong enough to help fight back the microbes. And then he pulls back and treats even more to get them even healthier, right? So I think it's wise to guide people that it's never just Lyme disease. It's many other things that are contributing to our illness. But I think you're zooming out even more. You're saying what kills our cells. It's not just microbes like Lyme disease, but it's things like toxins, trauma, stress, and EMFs. But beyond that, what can we do to help our body build new cells to be even healthier, right? So it's even deeper. You're zooming out even more than just a microbe. So I like that approach where forget about Lyme. What other things kill cells? But then how can we rebuild cells and take that approach? Right. So the toxin side, though, is really what concerns me because we love Dr. Bill Rawls. He's an herbalist, and watched a webinar of his recently on detoxification, and he talked about how there's over 200,000 man-made toxins. So when it comes to toxins, we have natural toxins and man-made toxins, and as modern life progresses, we're seeing more and more man-made toxins in combination with existing natural toxins, plus a higher stress lifestyle, which is that stress component of what kills our cells. And I think it's making more and more people chronically ill. And many of them probably have Lyme, and many of them probably don't have Lyme. But it's just this culmination factor of all these things making them sick. So what do you do with your patients to address the toxin component? Because whether it's your makeup, whether it's, like you said, mold or mycotoxins and heavy metals, there's so many things out there, microplastics, all of these things that impact our bodies. And we have to detox out in order to feel better.
Yeah, this is probably the one where I would say there's the most options and most of them are good. I love ionic foot bath. I use ion cleanse, glutathione intravenously, saunas. I have a Hocket machine, which is an ozone sauna, lymphatic drainage. I really like Cellcore's biotoxin binder, HMET binder. I use a daily binder from Inwell. There's so many steps to this, right? Because you have to get the toxin from the cell to the lymphatics, from the lymphatics to the blood, from the blood to the liver. At the liver, it has to be conjugated so that it can be now fat soluble, and then you can poop it out you get it into your intestine. From your intestine, you have to get it past the ileocecal junction where you would reabsorb a lot of the toxins and poop it out, right? And so most docs, I think if they're doing a good job, are starting with the last step, which is poop. Because if you don't poop, it won't matter that you got everything ready, right? And so everything from a colonic to just a coffee enema is going to be hugely important. And it's so fascinating. The more fragile the patient, the more you got to start at that end and then just work backwards, right? And you got to pay enough attention to say, okay, I gave them this binder, they're constipated, I got to stop the binder. I can't just say push through, right? I got them pooping, now I can give them a tiny bit of binder, but it's not doing much because their lymphatics are so congested that I have to have them rebound or be on a vibration plate. They're still not moving anything. It's such a mess in there. Let's use an ionic foot bath and let's get them to pee the stuff out instead of poop it out. So it's complicated, I guess is the best way to say that, but you already know that.
Yeah, and you just gave us a ton of tips there. And to pivot over to microbes, right? I mean, your colleagues at iLads, and we have it on our website. We have a page called Lyme Persists, where there's over 700 peer-reviewed scientific articles that prove Lyme will persist despite standard antibiotic treatment, right? So if that's the case, we know it's not easily eradicated. Some argue that when you have chronic Lyme, it can never fully be eradicated, but you can feel better and it goes dormant. Some argue that it can be fully eradicated. But regardless, what's your approach to treating Lyme disease? Because we know once you're at the chronic stage, it's not easy to address it.
You bet. All right. So that's a great question too. And it's a question that most of my patients, that's the question they really, it's like the end of the visit. They're like, but tell me those things. I break it into 5 categories as far as killing a microbe. And when I say microbe, the reality is you've got bacteria, viruses, funguses, protozoa, and parasites. And Lyme is a bacteria. It's also sort of a protozoa when it's in that round body form because it behaves like a parasite. That's why Lyme, I think, gets more attention because it's harder to kill than the others. But killing microbes, it doesn't matter if you have Bartonella or if you have Lyme, we got to kill it, or at least kill some of it, right? If we could kill all of it, fantastic. So there's 5 ways to kill a microbe. You can use an herb, and plants don't want to die, but they don't have an immune system, right? And so what do plants do to try to not have the bacteria or the funguses eat them? Well, they excrete some phytochemicals that are unfriendly to the not so nice microbes. And they happen to be friendly to the more friendly microbes, which is important because the plant has to be colonized with something. Otherwise, the unfriendly microbe will colonize it, right? So herbs are great, but I also would say that herbs are better at defense than offense. These plants have been excreting the chemical every day since they were a seedling, right? And you haven't been excreting that chemical. So it's going to take a long time for an herb to fight off something that's colonized you, right? Like the plant was never overwhelmed with Lyme. It was just avoiding it, right? So herbs are great, but they're going to work slower. So that's option 1. And we could go into all sorts of details. I like Byron White. I like Beyond Balance. You could use cat's claw and Japanese knotweed and all sorts of different things, right? So, but herbs are great, but they're going to work slow. I have a brother that lives in Maryland and he has Lyme disease and he treats it mostly with herbs. And that's because his symptoms are pretty mild. He doesn't really want to do anything else and he's doing okay with it. So it's a good approach. Antibiotics, and with regard to antibiotics, just like herbs, there's, at least 50 to choose from. I wouldn't say hundreds, but there's a lot. But if you think about an antibiotic, what we've done is, and I'm not a scientist, I'm a clinician, but the scientists have taken these naturally occurring things and tweaked them a little to make them more deadly. But by making them more deadly, they also now kill stuff we didn't necessarily want to kill, right? Like penicillium is a mold that happens to be the origin of penicillin. But in order to make it into penicillin, we changed it a little bit, right? Now it's more deadly. It works better, but it also kills things we don't want to kill. So as far as antibiotics go, I think probably a lot of your listeners know. I mean, doxycycline and metronidazole, good place to start. Ceftin, hydroxychloroquine, Tindamax. So you've got your tetracyclines, you got your macrolides. You could use IV things. You got all sorts of options, and that's just for Lyme. Then you got to look at rifampin and Biaxin for Bartonella, and maybe you throw in some methylene blue, and then you got to take Mepron for Bartonella or for Babesia. It gets complicated, and that is honestly the way that I initially was treating Lyme because it's the best we knew. That was the gold standard, and there's nothing wrong with that approach as far as saying, hey, I got to be treated. What can I do? The upside to antibiotics is that oftentimes they're covered by insurance. The downside is that I could make you sicker than you were to start with, just in a different way, right? So I don't think it's fair to say antibiotics are bad, but I also don't think that they should currently be the first place to start for everybody. So next would be oxidative therapies. Oxidative therapies are things that steal electrons. So the naturally occurring oxidative therapy in your body is hydrogen peroxide. You make these little vesicles called peroxisomes, and peroxisomes just dump out. And H2O2 is hydrogen peroxide. So you've got 2 oxygens and 2 hydrogens. And what happens is one of the hydrogens translocates over to the first oxygen. Now you've got H2O plus an oxygen that got kicked out of the group. And the oxygen has a positive charge. It wants an electron, and it steals electrons from wherever it can get them. Well, what's interesting is that microbes that are creating inflammation have more electrons. And so you steal those electrons and you'll kill bad microbes without killing good microbes. That's my working theory of how that actually works. And we can replicate that with ozone or with high dose vitamin C or colloidal silver. And so that's going to kill bad guys and spare good guys. And the question is, if you do it long enough, can you eradicate the infection? And maybe the answer is yes. The same thing's true of antibiotics. Maybe the answer is yes. The same thing is true of herbs. But maybe the answer isn't yes, and that's the ongoing debate. So category number 4, UV light. So UV light kills stuff. The big upside is it's pretty indiscriminate. It'll kill microbes, and I shouldn't have microbes in my blood. The sort of downside is, well, not all the Lyme is living in my blood. Some of it's in my knee joint or my cerebrospinal fluid. And so I can do UV light, but it won't kill the Lyme living in my brain, right? And then the 5th category is oligonucleotide therapy, or a lot of people call it SOT or SOT, supportive oligonucleotide therapy. This is my sort of first step if people can afford to do this at this point, because I found it is so effective. I don't think it's a panacea. It doesn't cure everything, but this is genomic. So what you've got is microbes have either DNA or RNA, which is their genome for how they replicate. If you can isolate a gene that is unique to that microbe, that doesn't exist in any other microbe and doesn't exist in people, you can make millions of copies of that gene. Now, when the microbe tries to replicate, it has to open up its DNA and make a second copy on either side. When it does that, that little oligonucleotide grabs on, making replication impossible, and so it dies off. I've found that people have a much less severe Herxheimer reaction. So in fact, I started using this for my very sickest patients because there was nothing else I could do for them. And I was really blown away by, 1, that they tolerated it at all, but 2, that it was effective. And so eventually, I've been doing it now maybe 4 years. Eventually, I was like, I feel like I can't not present this to everyone as an option. So now when patients see me, I just say, look, these are the 5 things on the menu. You don't have to just pick one. We're trying to reduce the number of microbes. So these are all the methods. So does that make sense?
It does. And with SOT, though, I'm curious because generally with most of your patients, I'm sure it's polymicrobial, meaning it's not just Lyme disease, it's not just Borrelia
Right.
it's not just, Babesia, right? And with SOT therapy, it's very targeted from what I understand, meaning it's
It is.
going after a particular species of a particular pathogen. So if that's the
That's
case, you're really just addressing one of many problems or one of many microbes, right? So is
Yeah,
the
for it to
success
be
rate
effective, you have to
variable?
do each one. And that's why because I've heard a lot of people say, oh, well, I was on a, chat page, or I looked on Facebook and I heard that it doesn't work. It's been my clinical experience that that's exactly true. If you come into the doctor and you have your positive Lyme test, DNA connections or IGeneX or whatever, if all you did was an immunoblot from IGeneX and you have Lyme and we do SOT, well, I would say you've got a 15% chance of getting better because the odds that you have something in addition to Lyme are super high. I promise you, if you're a Lyme patient, you don't just have Lyme disease. The number of patients that have only had Borrelia burgdorferi when I do a broad test, it can't be more than 5%, right? And so in order to make SOT an effective treatment, you have to treat their Bartonella henselae different with an individual SOT than their Borrelia garini or their Borrelia miyamotoi, right? And SOT is not a cure-all because they don't have an SOT for every single infection. There's no SOT for Borrelia maritima. There's no SOT for Borrelia spielmanni. And so you just can't treat it with that. But you're right. So I have a few patients that maybe they only need 2 SOTs. I have other patients that have done, I think I talked to a lady yesterday. She's done 11. And I only see her now once a year because she's like, I'm doing great. Well, it was 11 SOTs. That's a lot.
Yeah. What are your thoughts as far as patients continue to get better, to continue to address all of these things, right? Creating new healthy cells, reducing the amount of cellular death, and also as part of that, addressing microbes, toxins, trauma, stress, and EMS on a regular basis. Because I think what we see most often in this chronic Lyme community is people feel a little bit better. They start to do things and become a little more loose, right? Maybe pull back on treatment, stay up late, drink more, eat worse. And those things are now compromising their health and they become really sick again, right? So what is your views on that with your patients long term as you get them better, with relapse rates and their behavior that's leading to either A, a relapse, or B, a sustainable level of health?
Yeah, that's super important. It's maybe, it's every bit as important as every other step, right? There are absolutely people that got bit by a tick and they crashed. I actually think we should talk about Justin and his story a little bit. Maybe we'll have to do another podcast about that, but that was his scenario, right? He got bit by a tick and probably within 6 weeks, he had type 1 diabetes. And within a year, he was the sickest Lyme patient that I've ever seen. Seizures, near death. In fact, I would say Justin died twice. Correct me if it's more than that, Justin, but I think he's actually died in the hospital twice. And so you can get sick like that with Lyme disease. But most people, they got bit by a tick when they were 12 years old at summer camp, and they felt a little achy and had a headache, and then they never realized it and they were fine. And over the course of their life, they got some microbes, they got some other toxins, maybe they got COVID, maybe they got pregnant with their second child, and they slowly got sicker and sicker. Then we diagnosed them with Lyme disease, and we got them by doing all of these steps, we got them better. And then they're like, oh, good, I'm well, I can be normal again. Well, yeah, well, guess what? Normal in the United States in 2024 is you feel like crap. That's normal. We cannot live the life we are living, eating the industrialized foods with the pesticides, feeding our microbiome, this very narrow index of foods, being exposed to all the toxins we're exposed to, 200,000. I think there's 80,000 things on that are the MSD data sheet and 200,000 chemicals, right? And we're going to invent new ones. And what's weird is I love living in 2024 because if I had to live in a time when we didn't have flush toilets, I would not have liked it as much, right? So the trade-off is worth it. I would rather live now knowing that I might be chronically ill than live at the time when I had to be a coal miner in England digging on my belly, in a shaft that's only 3 feet high, and the king gets all the money. And kings did not live as well as we do, right? And so we want to harken back to this amazing time. No, it was pretty crappy back then too. We just have a different kind of crappy. So back to your point though, is you cannot be normal and feel good, because normal doesn't feel good. Normal in America is overweight, tired, and depressed, right? So if you're once you get to feel healthy, then you have to, like you say, pay attention to those things. How do I detoxify? How do I optimize my microbiome? How do I reduce my stress and confront whatever trauma I've had? How do I not live near a cell tower or not have my phone next to my head all the time? And how do I optimize my hormones and eat well and get all the nutrients and all the minerals I need, right? It would be no different than saying, hey, how do I make sure that I stay abreast of information as it comes in? Well, you should read a book every probably 3 months. You should read a new book, no matter who you are, right? Let's say we should take care of our health. We should take care of our mind. We should take care of our loved ones. We should take care of our community.
So, Dr. Petersen, I want to talk about the EMF component of the what kills our cells model that you gave us, because we had Jody Hudson on this podcast, and her daughter Alex Hudson passed away, unfortunately, due to complications from Lyme. And she now has the Alex Hudson Lyme Foundation out of California. And she shared with us that her daughter was extremely sensitive to EMFs. I mean, she had anything, if she was near a router, it would trigger her MCAS like off the hook. So why are some of us more vulnerable and more susceptible to EMFs than others? It's very much like mold, right? Is it a detoxing ability? Like this whole, we hear about the MTHFR gene with detoxification. We hear about some people are just more sensitive. Some people have smaller toxic buckets. But what is it really that make us vulnerable to things like EMF? And why are electromagnetic frequencies so bad for us? You kind of touched on that earlier, but I want to make sure we really hit on
that. There's probably a scientist out there that will say he oversimplified it, and I'm trying to simplify it, and maybe that's the only way I can understand it. But if we understand the basics of how physiology works, I think the simple reality is our cells are electrical. The way a cell works, and if you think about the word cell, a cell is just something that keeps one thing in and another thing out, right? Like a jail cell keeps one guy in, the rest of the guys out. A battery cell keeps the charge on this side and not on this side. Well, your cells in your body, it's just a bag with a nucleus inside of it. And the nucleus has the DNA. And then there's these little things called the Golgi apparatus and the endoplasmic reticulum and the mitochondria. And all that is the machinery to have the cell do its job, whatever its job is, right? And my muscle cells, the job of the muscle cell is to contract. The job of the brain cell is to maybe dump out some dopamine or serotonin. The job of the skin cell would be to excrete keratin, right? In order for it to do that, all those parts inside there can't do anything unless there's a charge that's created on the membrane. So the membrane of the cell is where most of the exciting part happens in molecular biology. And you've got these little pumps, and you pump out calcium, and you pump in magnesium, and you pump out sodium, and you pump in potassium, and now the cell can fire. And if the cell's able to fire, it can do whatever its job is. And the one that we lack the most of is magnesium. I remember giving Justin IV magnesium, and it would like save him. And that was the only thing we could do. He was so fragile. The only thing we could do was give him IV magnesium and his cells would start to work again, right? It was weird. All right, so EMF. Well, that firing of the cell is an electrical frequency, but my muscles fire different than my brain, right? Well, Lyme is on a different frequency than my muscle cells. This is Royal Rife, who developed a Rife machine, was not crazy. He knew what he was doing, right? The only issue I have with Rife is, was it programmed accurately? Because if it is, and that frequency is the accurate frequency to break that microbe, great, use it. Just don't overdo it, because you'll get sick just like with any other treatment. But back to your question, I'm sorry, this is rambling.
No, before you answer the question, can I ask you a follow-up? Because in addition to Rife, we had the founder of Freemedica on, the Wave 2, now the Nikki. Is that similar technology? And what are your views towards that as well?
No, I'm open to all those things, because it's sort of silly to not be open to quantum physics. We know it's real. We just aren't smart enough, right? But yes, things have frequencies, and we have frequencies. But that girl who was so sensitive, her frequencies of her liver and heart and muscles were sort of like mine, which is why we can do an EKG, and the tracing is going to be showing up for all of us. We're sort of tuned the same as humans, right? And so, to the question, so yes, I would say that technology is legitimate. I don't understand all of it, but to say it's not, to say it's silly is absurd. I think we do need to understand it better. And just like a Lyme test might not have every antibody we need, or it's not as sensitive as we need, a Rife machine might not be perfectly programmed, and the Babesia frequency is only Babesia microdia and not Babesia oticolii, right? So it doesn't, that's why it fails, right? It doesn't fail because it's ineffective against one thing. It fails because it's too hard to tune it for everything. But back to this girl and how people are different levels of sensitivity. I honestly think it comes back to, if we realize that when we're around a frequency, we're going to either increase or decrease the hospitality, if you will, of our body for a microbe, right? If I'm around a certain frequency, it becomes more hospitable for that microbe or less hospitable for that microbe. And so if the microbe starts to die or starts to replicate, in either case, my immune system is now going to have to respond. And I think this is actually where the difference is in the immune response. This is why MCAS becomes the reason. That's the thing that they all see. I don't see very many other things besides an uptick in their MCAS symptoms when they're really EMF sensitive, and that's because MCAS is an immune issue. Okay, so what happens is she's around a frequency. She either has more of that microbe or less of that microbe. Now, if she has more, it seems obvious that her immune system would kick up with respect to its reactivity. If she has less, her immune system will also kick up with respect to reactivity, because as the microbes die, they actually are being cleaned up through the lymphatics, and your immune system sees them, and it doesn't know if they're dead or alive. It just knows they're there. That's why I actually think a lot of a Herxheimer reaction is the immune response kicking up into high gear, not just the toxins and the death of the microbe. And I don't think we pay enough attention to that immune side, which is why things like low-dose immunotherapy, if you haven't had Ty Vincent on the show, you should, are so effective. Ty Vincent, T-Y is his first name, Vincent, V-I-N-C-E-N-T. Great guy. Immune therapy is going to calm down the immune system so that it doesn't keep overreacting. And this goes back to that autonomic dysfunction of trauma. Their bodies are in this level of it reacts to everything, and it overreacts very quickly. EMF causes them to have either more or less microbe, which causes them to have an increase in immune response. And just like that, it feels like they got a worse infection.
Right.
So it's really interconnected. And for some patients, I love Neil Nathan too. He'll say, treat the mold first. Well, I think he's right, in as much as if you can calm down the immune response, then you can start making headway with Lyme. I have found using SOT, I don't have to treat the mold first, because since the Herxheimer reaction is so mild with SOT, their immune system can handle that. And frankly, it's the Lyme, it's the vector-borne infections, in my opinion, that are the most immune disorienting. Your body is more immune impacted by those infections than anything else. And this is just my theory. I'm not a scientist. I couldn't prove it. But the reason that that's my theory is because vector-borne infections have adapted to not kill their host, right? Pneumonia will kill you. A urine infection would kill you. Either you kill it or it kills you. But Lyme has no intention of killing you. It's just looking for a nice place to live. And it's not going to populate to the point that you die. That's why Lyme patients don't die of Lyme very often, right? When they do, it's because they had some immune dysfunction that spiraled out of control, but the majority of them just suffer for decades, right? And so because this whole, and if you think about the nature of this microbe, being vector-borne means that it lived in one mammal, and it got transmitted to another, I should say animal, because lizards could have these too. It gets transmitted from one animal to another by the bite of something or by a needle stick, right? Well, the deer didn't shorten its life experience because it had Lyme, and you actually probably don't shorten your life experience. Your experience is just worse, right? Now, the good thing for deer and mice is that they don't live long enough to have too many symptoms, right? They only live to be 12 or 14. You're going to live to be 87, right? And so you're going to have more and more symptoms as you go on. So because I think vector-borne infections are the most dramatic impact, negative impact on our immune system, if we can treat them first, great, let's do that. If we can't, we have to go to the thing that you can tolerate treatment before your immune system freaks out. That's where the MCAS patients get so much of a difficult time. It's like we have to eliminate all their food, and then we have to eliminate every chemical that they're around, but we still haven't actually got to the cause of their problem, which I believe is the tick-borne infection. But if we try to treat it, they get worse. The same thing is true with EMF. Because the EMF exaggerates the amount of microbe that their immune system sees, their immune system freaks out.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I guess my question with EMFs and frequencies in general, when it comes to bad and good frequencies, because I'm hearing there are some good frequencies to make your cells less hospitable to Lyme or tick-borne illnesses, and other frequencies that make it, that can make it the opposite. But my question is, just because one frequency might make your cells less hospitable, does it mean that that same frequency might make your cell more hospitable to a competing microbe, right? Does that make sense? Like
Sure,
one
yeah,
frequency is good for one bacteria, but bad for another bacteria. So it's
Yeah.
kind of having this weird effect in your body,
I think that's absolutely true. That's actually a really insightful point. It's just like food, right? Like if I decide to eat nothing but broccoli, the bacteria that are going to thrive in my gut are the ones that like broccoli. And eventually that will be bad for me because I'll be too monolithic in the amount of bacteria that I have in my gut, right? And so frequencies are that way. Now, I will say this about frequency. The Earth has a frequency. What creates an electromagnetic field is if you spin electricity in a circle. So to make an electromagnet, like the things that pick up the cars at the junkyard, all they do is they have a big wire that goes in a big circle and they turn on the power, and now you've got an electromagnet, right? And when they turn off the power, it drops the car. Well, the Earth is creating an electromagnetic field all the time because it's being pounded by ultraviolet radiation. Well, not just ultraviolet, by all the radiation from the sun. Meanwhile, it's spinning in a circle. And so that's creating this electromagnetic field of the Earth. That's why your compass points north. There's not some big deposit of lead in the North Pole. It's because it's pointing to the electromagnetic field created by the Earth spinning in a circle. And all forms of life on the Earth are tuned to that frequency. That's the frequency that we are used to living in, whether it's a plant or an animal, right? So we create other frequencies because they do something useful for us, right? Like I like listening to the radio back when the radio was a thing. And it's really convenient that we can do this podcast and you're in New York and I'm in Utah, right? So we need these frequencies, but that's not to say that they couldn't do us harm. So we have to be cautious about them. And I think putting our head in the sand and saying, oh no, they couldn't hurt you at all. Well, that's absurd. What do you mean they couldn't hurt you at all? We just don't know how they're hurting us. Let's look into it.
Yeah. Yeah. So I want to ask you about because we keep talking about the gut and the microbiome, the gut-brain connection, right? The gut-brain axis, because the more I learn, the more I feel that's a really important connection that not many doctors are aware of. So can you speak to that, right? As far as how your gut health can correspond to your mental health and also, how it controls your physical health as well. I mean, when I first got sick with Lyme disease, I never had any kind of anxiety, and I had crippling panic attacks in my early 20s. And I'm like, what is this? Like, I've never experienced that in my life.
Yeah.
All kinds of weird neurological stuff, psychological and neurological, vision loss, you name it, right? Like hallucinations, seizures. So what is that correlation between the gut and the brain? And then even deeper, how does Lyme impact the brain neurologically speaking when it actually passes the blood-brain barrier and infects our neurological system?
Right. There's a lot of good questions in there. I'll address the last one first. When Lyme goes into your brain, the sheer presence of the microbe is going to create inflammation. Okay. And at the heart of any disease is inflammation. So now you've got some level of inflammation, so the cells don't work as well, right? So that's and that's true not just in your brain. That's if Lyme is in my elbow, it's going to create inflammation and I'll have arthritis. The immune side is, did I make antibodies to the Lyme and the antibodies attached to the glia of my brain, or the antibodies attached to my elbow? And so now it's not the bacteria creating the symptom, it's the antibody, right? So that's the immune versus the bacteria. But with respect to the gut-brain connection, maybe I should back up a little bit. At the very beginning, I said there's 2 things that make you repair and 4 things that make you break. There's one really important thing that unifies all of that, and that's your gastrointestinal tract. Because if you think about it, your bugs, 90% of them, they live in your gut. And your detoxification pathways, yeah, you can pee out some toxins, you can sweat out some toxins, but I guarantee you're pooping out a lot more toxins than you're peeing out or sweating out, right? So your liver and your digestive tract are the biggest detoxifier. And your autonomic nervous system, that's actually exclusively in your gut with respect to the first step. The enteric nerves make up 1% of all the nerves in your body, and the enteric nerves just run along your GI tract. And their only job is to tell you if you're safe or if you're in danger. And they send the message to your brain through your vagal nerve. And then your brain sends the message down to your sympathetic or parasympathetic nerves. And so if you start at the enteric nerves and say, hey, let's fix it here, then you can fix that fight or flight that we get stuck in. If it's okay, I'll take a little bit of time to talk about this. As whole people, we are physical, mental, and spiritual, and we are inseparably physical, mental, and spiritual. And you can have trauma in any of those ways, and doctors mostly like to talk about physical stuff because everything else is metaphysical, and we feel weird about it. But we can't feel weird about it and get people better, right? So if you fall off your bike and skin your knee, you broke some cells. It was physical trauma. If you ride your bike 100 miles, maybe you wore out your meniscus. It was physical stress. In either case, you broke a cell. But the way that I try to explain this, it's objective for patients, and they don't think I'm trying to be religious or like metaphysical. If you separate 2 cells, that's physical trauma. If I separate you from your mom, or you from your dog, or you from your partner, well, that's emotional trauma. It could be fight, it could be neglect, it could be abuse, right? If you feel distant from God, that's spiritual trauma, right? And in the case of the second 2, your enteric nerves are actually going to send a message that says you're not safe. And this is why things like ketamine-assisted psychotherapy or a program like VitalSide that helps you to, rebuild your
Is that Dr. Kathleen King?
Yeah.
We've had her on. She's my favorite when it comes to neuroplasticity. We've had a lot of them on, so I'm glad
exactly.
you brought her up. Yeah, she's awesome.
That's why it matters so much, because if your body can't feel safe, then you can't calm down the immune system, reduce your heart rate, shift the blood to your digestive tract so you can break stuff down. Like once you're in fight or flight, good luck getting the nutrients because your digestion doesn't even work anymore, right? Now there's one other, I just go on tangents everywhere. I'm sorry. I'm like a squirrel.
You're good.
So where was I? Oh yeah. So your gut does the autonomics. This is important too. Your gut is actually where most of your lymph nodes are. You've got some lymph nodes in your peripheral body, like your neck, under your arms, in your groin, in case you stepped on a tack or, heaven forbid, got bit by a tick, right? And your lymph nodes will swell up and say, hey, we got some bacteria. But only 10% of your lymph nodes are peripheral. 20% are in your lungs, and that's because you breathe 12 times a minute. Stuff doesn't generally go through your skin, so you don't need a lot of, security cameras peripherally. Stuff goes into your lungs all the time, so let's put some security cameras there. But 70% of your lymph nodes run along the GI tract. It's called your GALT, which is gastric-associated lymphoid tissue, and MALT, mucosally associated lymphoid tissue. And so all of the immune response, not all, 70%, is anatomically in your gut. So you've got to get your gut healthy so that your autonomic system calms down, your immune system calms down, you can detoxify, and you have the right bugs. And then on top of that, you make the majority of your neurotransmitters in your gut. So if you need to make serotonin, you'll only make it in your gut. 90% is made in your gut. GABA, dopamine, you're making it in your gut. So if you don't have a healthy gut, you're going to get depressed. Now, Lyme patients get depressed for a few reasons, but just a patient that eats lots of potato chips and hamburgers, they still get depression. They don't have Lyme. They just get depression because their gut is sick. So you've got the autonomic part that is the gut-brain axis, and then you've got that's the factory for me to make my neurotransmitters, and then therefore I'll also have depression and anxiety. So some of it is just where anatomically is this process happening, and some of it is that connection between the autonomic nervous system saying you're in danger, and therefore you stay in fight or flight. I promise you, if you're in fight or flight, you're going to use up serotonin faster. So now you're making it slower, using it faster, and life then feels like, what's the point? And you've become suicidal when it's got nothing to do with the fact that you're really sick. Now, being really sick, that's grief. That's not depression. And if you're in grief, if you're like, life has no purpose, this is horrible, you could be stuck in grief because life continues to be horrible for, decades. But from a medical perspective, that's not the same as depression, which is simply you're using serotonin faster than you can make it. And now you cannot feel joy even when something joyful happens.
Let's talk about the role of the lymph nodes in healing, right? Because you talked about the lymph nodes and how that plays in. And we've had Dr. Monica Embers, who's a researcher in the Lyme field, talk to us about how she's witnessed Lyme, and I quote her because I think it just was powerful. Lyme obliterates your lymph nodes, right? So how does that relationship between our lymph nodes, our immune system, and Lyme disease, which obliterates our lymph nodes, what does it have on our health, and how do you overcome that when treating Lyme patients?
Right. Yeah. Good question. And I say lymph nodes, and I assume everybody knows what happens there. Your lymph nodes are where your body determines if something is you or not you. Your immune system's super basic. All it's doing is just looking at the stuff that goes through the lymphatics. You're cleaning up your body, and it just says, is this me or not me? Because your cells break down just from, wearing out. And so you're taking all these things, and your body has these little things on the outside of the cells called HLA complexes. That's sort of like the zip code. And it just says, oh yeah, that's me, that's me, that's me, that's me. But when somebody goes through the lymph node that isn't you, you make an antibody. And you can make a variety of antibodies. You can make B cell antibodies. You can make T cell antibodies. You can make 4 different kinds of T cell antibodies and 5 different kinds of B cell antibodies. And you can make natural killer cells. And all of these are made based on what you saw in the lymph node. And so now you've got all these antibodies. And your body doesn't know if something's dangerous. It just knows it's not you. And so you're just as likely to make an antibody against strawberries or mercury or Lyme, right? They're all not you. And once your body starts to make more antibodies than is useful, which it will only do because you're kicked into fight or flight, and so now your body's like, I got to make a lot of antibodies because we're at war. Well, it starts making antibodies to everything that it sees that isn't you. And that's how people develop things like gluten sensitivity or sensitivity to, Bed Bath & Beyond candles, is because their immune system is like, wait, all of this is foreign. I will make too many antibodies to everything. So the lymph node is really where that happens. And the reason that Lyme blows it up is because all this Lyme is circulating through your lymph nodes, and your lymph nodes are just on like red alert, making all these antibodies to Lyme, and they get infected. If a lymph node gets infected, you actually have to go to the hospital and get it cut out, or you die. It's very rare that happens. Don't be alarmed. That's not happening to you. You just have lymph nodes that are like, there's just too much on their plate.
So talk to us about the neuroplasticity component of it, right? Because that's really where the nervous system comes into play. Dr. Kathleen King, we hear about DNRS, we hear about the GUPTA program, right? And I think what you're saying there is if we can use some of these tools to help regulate our nervous system, so sort of reset our neural pathways, which then resets those nerves in our vagus nerve to promote a healing or a calming state rather than an overwhelmed state, that's going to help us heal as well. Is that the general idea? If you can just kind of help us break it down and simplify it,
And I'll say this too. The reason that I came up with this sort of way to describe this to people is because there are so many people out there that have one thing that they're like, if you do this, you'll be better. And they're right part of the time because it's the thing that was the right at that moment. It would be sort of like if I was a football coach and if I just said, hey, if you'll just run this one play, if you'll always run a post play, you'll win the game. Well, you can't win the game by just running a post play every time, right? And you cannot get everybody better by having them do vital side. But I guarantee you that there are people that won't get better until they do vital side, because that's the step that they can take, right? And so those things that will help us reset our autonomic nervous system, calm that down, and there's a bunch of different steps that you can interfere in and make a positive difference, are super worthwhile to try. If you as a Lyme patient feel stuck, you're like, everything I do makes me feel worse, I would say start with those things, right? And I'll say things like those cell retraining programs, if I just call them broadly rather than a particular one. I like Vital Side. That's what I recommend for my patients, but there's a lot of them out there, and I'm confident that probably everybody that developed one did it with the best intention. They're probably good, right? Like Coke and Pepsi. You can do vagal nerve specific things like acupuncture or vagal nerve stimulator, alpha stim, dolphin vagal nerve stimulator. That's interfering with the message going from the gut to the brain, right? You could start at the gut and say, well, I have to get if my microbes aren't healthy, of course, my gut feels like it's in danger. With or without Lyme, it feels like it's in danger. I'll start there. So you can start at the gut. You can start at the vagal nerve. You can start with if you've had trauma, essentially, in my opinion, how I would describe it is you have something that happened that is stuck in your limbic system. It has not been filed into the white matter of your brain. Because it has not been filed into the white matter of your brain, it's as though it's still happening today. So if I was abused as a little kid, that's happening to me every day because I've never been able to put that into the white matter of my brain. And so, of course, I'm not safe. How could I possibly be safe? And so my immune system is going to kick into high gear like crazy. So the only way you can really say, oh, what do I do? Okay, well, go to a therapist. Well, I've been to a therapist. Okay, well, use ketamine-assisted psychotherapy. Well, that didn't work. Okay, well, go do psilocybin or ashwagandha, or not ashwagandha, ayahuasca, right? Like, not that I'm recommending those things because I don't want to go to jail, but those are things that you have to overcome these traumas or you cannot get better, right? So every single step in that the gut immune axis or gut brain axis, it's actually gut brain immune is how it's generally talked about, is so important because, and it almost doesn't matter, chicken and an egg, start where you want, start with the chicken, start with the egg, start somewhere. If where you started isn't working, understand what the next step would have been and try again. Don't give up. I honestly don't think there's a Lyme patient out there that cannot get better as long as they don't give up. They need the kind of support that Justin gave and got. They need the kind of support that you gave and got so that they don't give up, because it doesn't matter where you are on the circle. If you figure out where to interfere and make the change that works, you'll be on your way to spiraling upward.
Justin, did you want to say something, Justin?
When he was talking about trauma being inside the body, there's just a quote that I really like that is, trauma is not something that happened to you, it's something that's happening inside of you. And just what happened to you was the catalyst of what continues to happen inside of you for however long it takes you till you work on that and figure it out and do what you need to do to get it to leave,
I've got to read that book. I haven't read that one. The one that I've read that I think helped me understand that concept was by a guy named Gabor Mate.
Same guy. That's the quote. That's who I'm quoting when he
is that who you're quoting? Okay, yeah.
So I would like to ask though, because with specifically with gut health, right? If somebody's done a lot of gut damage, whether through overuse of antibiotics or whether through just bad diet, or we just suspect that they have gut issues, what are some tools we can use to repair the gut? I mean, I'm sure there are herbal remedies. Yeah. I'm sure there's a ton of tools, but if somebody listening is like, oh man, my gut is shot, what would you recommend to them?
Look, if I had to give them 3 pieces of advice here, take these things. There's a program called the GDRX program. Forum Health, who I work for, has the GDRX program. They're not the only ones that have a program like this, but it's an anti-inflammatory shake with a detox shake, right? That's step 1. Step 2, take transfer factor or immuno-G or colostrum, right? They're just types of colostrum. So the first step, decrease the inflammation. The second step, take these secretory IgA antibodies. They're going to start to fight all the excess stuff you have. Third step, take something like FC-Cytal or Biocidin, which is an herbal antimicrobial. And then the last step is take thanabiotic. Thanabiotic is essentially a fecal transplant. If you do those steps, you don't have to go see a doctor like me. You just got the advice. You would have paid $500 to somebody to tell you those steps, right? If you'll do that, you've at least got a 40%, 50% chance that your gut is better. And what's really amazing is for people that are like half sick, not your sickest Lyme patients, but they have Lyme, they feel like crap. If they'll just do that, a lot of them are like, oh, I got my life back.
Well, I want to ask you about the fecal transplant because what did you call it? I didn't recognize the name. You said
it's called thanabiotic, THAENA. Biotic.
Thanabiotic.
Yeah.
Okay.
I have
So we've
no interest in that product besides that it works.
we've had
Two
some people.
naturopaths up in Oregon developed it.
So some people have come on and had the fecal implants and said that it was like pivotal, like it was huge in their healing journey, right? They were all jacked up. It helped them with their gut. And it also helped them with their mood as well, they said. It made them just feel
100%.
happier because of that connection we talked about, right? But then we had about, I think it was only two people that have, and not, probably out of the five that have done it that have come on this podcast, two of the five had said that it negatively impacted them. And they actually almost like made them have like different emotions than they did before, like almost like more alarming emotions, if that makes sense. So how would you respond to that? Do you think it's a risk, or do you think that's just maybe a
No, I do
misperception
think
of what
it's a
really
risk.
happened?
I do think it's a risk. You are you're pulling a pretty strong lever when you give yourself a fecal transplant, right? I'm going to tell a quick story. Had a patient come into me. This would have been 10 years ago. Beautiful girl, college student, comes in and she presents herself as though she's just there for optimal health. And then she gets in the room and she's like, Dr. Petersen, I have Lyme disease. I purchased this ticket to go to the Netherlands. It's a year out. I am going to do physician-assisted suicide in a year if you can't help me. And I was like, oh my heavens, this is the worst experience of my life. She said, I can't get better. I've done everything. Please help me. And of course, I'm helping her. And we're talking about every possibility, right? You come in with that sort of a, modus operandi, and I'm like, well, whatever you need, I'll do whatever I can, right? Not on my advice, on her own volition, she goes onto Craigslist. She presents herself sort of the same way. She was a young, healthy, athletic girl, and she goes on dates with these guys. And then on the second date, if she's determined that they actually live a healthy lifestyle, she tells them the truth and says, look, I just want your poop. I just need your poop. I'm so sick, I'm going to die. So she gets poop from about 6 different guys, labels in the fridge, right? Brad, Greg, Chris. And then she does a teaspoon or tablespoon from each one of them over the course of several weeks, figuring out which one makes her feel the best. And then she calls up the 1 or 2 guys that make her feel the best and says, can you give me more poop? Right. And I have to say, because I don't want to go to jail, don't do this at home. But she's still alive today. She finished her graduate program at the University of Utah and is in good health, right? So that's a story of someone that just said, look, I got to be healthy. I don't know what else to do, and took this into her own hands. Here's what was happening. She's getting bacteria from other people. Maybe some of those bacteria didn't get along with her bacteria. Her bacteria sucked. We can all agree on that. But just because you got a fecal transplant doesn't mean you got the right stuff. How do you know what you got, right? And so she actually was in a master's program, and I can't remember, but it was a science program. It was some sort of a microbiology program, which is why she was like, I'm doing this, right? She understood well enough that I can't just get poop from my friend. I have to find the right stuff, right? So absolutely there's a risk of getting the wrong microbes. And that's why this is not legal. That's why the FDA has said, no, don't do this, because your friend might have Giardia. Your friend might have Toxoplasma gondii. You might get worse. You already are in a bad place. You're already a fragile patient. And then you're going to go blindly take somebody else's microbes, right? Having said that, it's hard to get worse microbes than you have. You're a sick Lyme patient. You could look on the street. You could randomly get bacteria from almost anybody. And you're like, well, it's probably better than mine. I'm in the bottom 3%. Right? So the odds are strangely in your favor, and yet you still have to recognize that this is not risk-free, and therefore it is not legal. I would say with Thanabiotic, what they've done is they said, hey, let's get 20-year-olds who were vaginally delivered, breastfed, haven't been on antibiotics, have no family history of autoimmune disease, and don't have autoimmune diseases, and we'll buy their poop and we'll screen it and look for all the microbes that would be bad for you. And then we'll wash it because poop is gross. And then we'll autoclave it so that it's legal. So what they've done is they've killed it. And that should make people think, well, how could it possibly work? And this comes back to your immune system. It's my opinion that the reason that it works is because we're not actually having to give you the bacteria. All we're having to do is show your immune system what the neighborhood is supposed to look like. Because it's your that's the only way your immune system knows what the outside world looks like, is what it sees in your gut, right? And it says, oh, that's what the world is like. So we're going to reinforce this as the standard. Right? If you get used to living in a really bad, dangerous neighborhood, well, it's not that big of a deal to see some, drug deal or prostitute or somebody strung out laying on the ground. If that's the neighborhood you live in, you feel a little bit on edge, but that's normal, right? If we change the neighborhood and say, hey, this is actually what the neighborhood looks like. And so even though the microbes are dead, the immune system starts to respond appropriately. It reinforces that. And here's the clinch. And I think this is a really important paradigm shift that we as physicians and patients need to be able to make. The microbes, it really is mathematically very unlikely that you kill the last one. And so if you have a bad microbiome, those good bugs that are mostly gone, they're not all gone. And that's okay. You just need them to grow back. The bad bugs that you have too much of, we don't need to kill every one of them. We need them to go down to the point where the good bugs are outnumbering them. And I suspect that most of the time with Lyme bacteria, Bartonella, that's what we do, because mathematically, the likelihood that the last bacteria and the last antibiotic interact is so mathematically unlikely that it just is, it's statistically impossible for that to kill the last bug, right? You have to rely on your immune system to kill the last bug, and your immune system doesn't actually work that way. You make antibodies commensurate with how much infection you have. So the lower your infection, the lower your antibodies. So your antibodies won't kill the last one, but it doesn't matter, because as long as the antibodies stay on top of it, you're never sick again. Does that make sense?
It does. And Dr. Petersen, we need to have you back on for a second interview if you're willing to come back, because this is just gold, and absolutely love everything we're talking about here. So I just want to give people an option to go learn more about you. So we're going to have contact information in the show notes of this podcast. We're going to list you on our featured doctors page of our website. But if you can just tell us, what is your website and how can people get in touch with you if they want to consider treating with you?
Sure. Forumhealth.com, FORUM health.com. We actually have offices around the whole country. I work in Salt Lake City. Part of why I started Forum Health was because there's a whole bunch of doctors that want to take good care of you, and they're a little scared and they're a little unsure, because that's what I was like when Dr. Holtorf was my mentor, right? And so you don't even have to come see me. You could come see one of our doctors in our Asheville, North Carolina office, or Austin, Texas, or Akron, Ohio, right? But if you go to Forum Health, you will find me, and you can come see me if you want to. But you could also see one of my colleagues, and that's the idea, is that they are all being trained to do this as well. Now, bear in mind, they're not all Lyme experts. Some of them are mold experts. Wally Taylor in Austin, Texas has been treating mold for 35 years. He's an ear, nose, throat surgeon. So we've got a good network of doctors, and they do want to help. I'm one of them. I'm just one of them.
Justin, I want to thank you for coming on to co-host this really awesome interview. And Dr. Petersen, thank you again for joining this podcast. There's been a ton of great information. We know our community is going to love it. So thank you both again.
Well, you're welcome. Thank you for having me. I've really enjoyed it.
Appreciate it.